Hello Cloud Pedagogians and welcome back to the course. In this lesson, I'm going to tell you about some technical terms like what an API is and why is it so important in the cloud world. I will also cover terms like elasticity, vertical and horizontal scaling. Next, we'll understand what is infrastructure as code. Also, I would like to dive deeper into public cloud and tell you the basics about three different cloud models like infrastructure as service, platform as service, and software as a service. So let me start with the API and why it is very relevant nowadays. The term API is an acronym and it stands for Application Programming Interface. APIs are mechanisms that enable two software components to communicate with each other. For example, every time you check the weather on your phone, the weather app on your phone talks to the weather system via APIs to show you weather updates. You are very likely to be using APIs every time you have a system communicating with other system or an interface communicating with a system. Nowadays, we use APIs all the time. But I bet you already used an API today even without knowing it. As we know, AWS allows infrastructure to be managed logically, meaning that instead of having to procure hardware, you can navigate into the AWS management console to launch and manage resources. When you are using the AWS web console, you are using API calls to the services using a web interface. These calls are always authenticated and encrypted. In AWS, you can do API calls using the web console as I just described. But you can also do API calls programmatically with the use of different programming languages like Python, C#, Java, and many more. Of course, we are not going to focus on programmatic API calls in this course, but I just wanted to let you know that it exists. And it's a way to do infrastructure automations and create software using cloud services. Another very common term I want you to know is elasticity. Elasticity means that things are scalable in a way so you can have less or more resources without burden in an easy way by doing API calls. Some cloud services are popular because they can scale automatically and transparently. In AWS, to name a few, Amazon S3, Amazon DynamoDB, Amazon SQS, Amazon SNS, Amazon SES, and many more. When we talk about elasticity, we think about scale. And when we think about scale, there are basically two concepts, scale in and scale out. It is also known as horizontal scaling. Scale up and scale down, also known as vertical scaling. Let me explain a little detail about this. As a green tea lover, let me use teacups to explain the differences. Every day in the morning, I need to drink 200 ml of tea to start my day. I can satisfy my tea needs in many ways. One is by drinking two smaller cups containing 100 ml each, and another is getting 200 ml cup as it is. Well, it is that simple. The small cup of a tea is a metaphor for horizontal scaling, while one larger cup is a metaphor for vertical scaling. In the IT space, we don't pour tea into servers obviously. So if you want to scale vertically, you must change the configuration infrastructure to have more hardware specs. In reality, let's say you have a requirement of having 32 gigabytes of memory and you have a server with 16 gigabytes. You can do vertical scaling by enlarging that server configuration to have more memory. In the cloud, that can be done with a simple API call. So, a server with 16 gigabytes of memory can be transformed into a server with 32 gigabytes of memory. You can also scale out horizontally by just adding another server. Horizontal scaling consists of having more resources of the same type to meet the requirements. In this case, having two nodes with 16 gigabytes each would totalize 32 gigabytes of memory. The practice of horizontal scaling grew organically and together with public cloud adoption because you don't need to concern with physical space. Public cloud has no limits on how many pieces of infrastructure you can get. Plus, you can have the benefit of distributing your cups of tea or better yet, infrastructure components over different physical facilities. In this case, the more the better. Losing one server out of a fleet of 10 servers means there is a 10% loss. But if you lose one and only had two, you lost 50% or half of the fleet. The good news is that some AWS managed services let you do vertically scaling with the push of a button or better an API call. Amazon ODS and Amazon Redshift are two examples. They are database and data warehousing services. And if you want to have bigger data nodes, the service takes care of doing so without any downtime. So to summarize, elasticity is when something is easily resizable. You can have vertical scaling and horizontal scaling. Vertical scaling means you have more infrastructure power by changing specs and making them stronger. Horizontal scaling means you have more infrastructure power by adding more pieces side by side. That's where the term horizontal comes from. They are added by side. API calls or requests made by a user to a service. In the AWS cloud, it can be done through the AWS Management Console or programmatically also. If you are creating an automation service or want to interact with infrastructure via code, you can use these both. Speaking about interacting with infrastructure via code, here goes another term. Again, you may encounter the term IAC, that means infrastructure as code. Infrastructure as code is the ability to provision and support your computing infrastructure using code instead of manual processes and settings. Any application environment requires many infrastructure components like operating systems, database connections, storage, etc. Developers have to regularly set up, update, and maintain the infrastructure to develop, test, and deploy their applications. Manual infrastructure management is very time consuming and prone to error, especially when you manage applications at scale. Infrastructure as code lets you define your infrastructure's desired state without including all the steps to get to that state. It automates infrastructure management so developers can focus on building and improving applications instead of managing environments. Organizations use infrastructure as code to control costs, reduce risk, and respond with speed to new business opportunities. The another term we hear always in the cloud technology is cloud models. IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS are sometimes referred to as cloud service models or cloud computing service models. It facilitates the use of software, applications, platforms, and infrastructures to develop an organization's activity. First, IaaS. Well, it's super simple to understand. Infrastructure as a service contains the basic building blocks for infrastructure, providing access to network, compute, and storage, and nothing more. Every time you are interacting with a public cloud provider and it's using virtual machines, you are using an infrastructure as a service model, meaning you are still responsible for managing the operating system, network, firewall, and storage. In a nutshell, it gives you more control, but at cost of less convenience. Next, PaaS. Now let me talk about platform as a service. Platform as a service gives you more convenience with a certain level of control. You are using a platform as a service when you have the provider helping with the management of the IT resources. This helps you to be more efficient as you don't need to worry about capacity planning, software maintenance, patching, or any heavy lifting that is involved in the setup and configuration of IT resources. Now let me switch and talk about the modality that gives you more convenience but less control, software as a service. This model gives you a product that is fully run and managed by the service provider. In most cases, people refer to end user applications because they are so easy to use that even someone with no IT knowledge can use and provide services for their customers. With software as a service, you don't have to think all about how the service is maintained or the underlying infrastructure is managed. A common example is a web email application where you can set up mailboxes and send and receive emails without having to understand anything about email protocols. AWS offers Amazon Workmail, Amazon Work Docs for document collaboration, and Amazon Workspace for desktops on the cloud. In addition, there are many AWS partner products from the AWS marketplace as well. Now, if you are thinking which model is the best, I'm sorry to say the answer is there no best. Actually, there is no best thing is something you will hear frequently, and it doesn't mean that things are complicated in the cloud. It just means that the cloud providers like AWS has many options to choose from, allowing you to craft solutions that fits to your needs. So if you're okay with managing operating systems and networks, and you can leverage more control by using infrastructure as a service. Sometimes that control is not desired and having someone managing the infrastructure is handy. In this case, platform as a service can be a good choice. Most AWS customers rely on this for their operations, and when you want something extremely simple to use without so much customization, software as a service can help. AWS does not put itself as infrastructure, platform, or software as a service. Wow, we have covered a lot today, isn't it? We have covered APIs and why it is so important. We have talked about scaling, IAC, and finally discussed cloud models. We hope to continue to meet your expectations in the future.